Apologetics panel. I'm Michael. I lead the college ministry here at TLC. I studied chemical engineering and math at Berkeley, and my hobbies, they're pretty nerdy. I like doing recreational math, amateur chemistry, and I like proving people wrong. But today, since I'm the moderator, I have to be well-behaved, so next, we'll start introducing some of our speakers. All right, so our first speaker is Pastor Bumble. Yeah. He is the IT director at Fullerton College. He's your lead pastor, RP, of course. He has a BS and MBA from Cal State Fullerton and an MDiv from Fuller Theological Seminary. Hobbies, surprisingly, Candy Crush and Pokemon Go. Oh, wait, no, I got that wrong. No, he plays Ingress, which was the precursor to Pokemon Go. Sorry, that's my bad. Yeah, next. Our next speaker is Tony Nguyen. You guys have met him, I think so, yeah. So he's our English ministry pastor. He got a BS in biological sciences at UCI, an MDiv with an emphasis on evangelism and discipleship from Talbot Theological Seminary. And his hobbies include cooking, traveling, and throwing barbecues, which he's a very good barbecue person, yeah. Very good at cooking meat. All right, you guys put your seatbelts on for the next one. So we're very lucky to have, actually, John Rittenhouse. So he's taught apologetics for quite a while, 18 years, guys, at, yeah. So 18 years at Biola, right? Or to over 150,000 students in 125 universities in over 7 countries. Right now, he's the president of Pursue Your Passion Ministries. He also is a chemical engineer, although I don't know how much he still remembers. But I was actually really surprised to learn that. Not too many people, like chemical engineering at all. He has 4 graduate degrees. So you guys hear, so MA in ministry, right? Moody Graduate School, Master's in Theological Studies, an MDiv from San Bernardino School of Theology, and then I think probably the most relevant one here is the Master's in Theology with an emphasis on philosophy and ethics at Talbot School of Theology. We'll continue. I have a second slide for him. Okay, so he's actually, you guys know of Campus Crusade for Christ. He was on staff for 29 years. He has spoken on a lot of topics, more than just apologetics. So he's talked some things like building severe friendships, and then especially on male sexuality and the pursuit of purity. If you guys have ever been to KCCC's Higher Calling, you may have seen him because he's spoken there 8 times, and he actually speaks pretty frequently at Chinese and Korean churches because he has a passion for doing ministry with Asians. And then his greatest passion, and so I've heard, this is actually the first time I've met him in person, but his greatest passion is mentoring men, okay? So he's a real bro, yeah. Great, let's get started. Question 1. The first question is, why do we need God to explain the universe? Okay, so if you guys know, modern science, most people agree that the universe began, People say, if you're a physicist, you'll say that's probably about 13.7 billion years ago. There's a common argument when you first are introduced to apologetics called the Kalam cosmological argument. So the argument goes like this. Anything that begins to exist must have a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe must have a cause. So Kalam, the implication is that this cause must be divine, right? Must be outside of the universe, not dependent of it. But a lot of people say that if that's the case, then where did God come from, right? That's a good question. And then what if there are an infinite number of universes, right? So yeah, let's say ours is here, but what makes ours special? Even if it was created, there's the idea of deism where God creates and this leaves it alone, right? So, right, now I'm going to hand it off to our panelists.
All right. Hey, welcome, guys. Thank you so much for having me. I'm afraid to be up here because I'm afraid that after a while you guys are going to realize, man, this guy he knows nothing. But I'm going to do my best to answer some of these questions from a pastoral point of view. I'm going to leave a lot of the details to my friend John over here, but I'm going to do my best to answer from from a pastoral point of view. I think the idea that I want to start with is it generally accepted that the universe began to exist? If so, then where did God comes from? I think a way where we can begin to address this question is to understand that there are things, everything that exists has an explanation for its existence. Yes, follow? Everything that exists has an explanation for existence. Now, there's two types of explanation. Either the explanation is from an external cause, or the explanation is from a necessity of cause, right? What I mean by that is if you look at the universe and you look at the fundamental aspects of the universe, you break it down to its basic aspect, what we see as matter. And when we ask the question, how does matter come about? What we see in experiments, what we see in data, what we see in science is that matter can only be created by matter, right? It cannot, in and of itself, exist outside of nothing. Matter cannot create from nothing, okay? So when we look at the universe as a whole, then one thing we can posit is that the universe has to, by its necessity, have an external cause to create it. So that's how we would say that the universe began to exist. Now, for God, though, God is the necessity of God. It becomes that the only way that God, if we look at God, God does not matter, right? And so the very definition of God means that he exists because it is necessary for him to exist from the very beginning. There is no cause to him. Now, again, the idea is, what is the essence of each of those things? The essence of universe is matter. The essence of God is outside of that. And so when we look at the essence of the universe as matter, it has to have some sort of external cause. When we look at God, we see God as a beyond that, and so therefore it's necessary that God does not have a existence or has a cause to his existence. He's always been there. Okay, so because of the essence of the universe versus the essence of God, we have to explain both in a different way. We can't just say because God exists, there must be some sort of cause for him. No, he exists because of necessity. The universe exists because of external causes, okay? There's two different things. So you don't try to put it together into one where you get confused, because in the universe, like I'm going to repeat myself, but in the universe, what we see is we see the essence of the universe being of matter. With God, we see the essence of God being who he is. And so then the cause of God is because he exists because it's necessary for him to exist. Over here, this exists because there's an external cause for him. That's the best I got for that one, yeah?
I have two stories for you. I always like to tell stories when questions are asked. So I'm going to actually answer question number 2 about, what caused God. So I was interacting with a Chinese student, Cal State, San Bernardino. And he asked me that question. He's like, what caused God? And I asked him a question back. I said, what color is the number 2? And he looks at me and he shakes his head and he says, 2 doesn't have any color. I said, that's the answer to your question. You've actually asked me what's called in philosophy a category fallacy question. The number 2 doesn't have color because it's not a physical object. God doesn't have a cause because he's always existed. So that's the answer to number 2. What color is the number 2? And then you can, get into the discussion. Second story is, I was doing a survey at Valley College in San Bernardino. Met a student by the name of James, and as I was going through the survey, I asked him, do you believe in God? And he says, no. And I smiled and I said, you really should. He's like, why? I said, because God exists and I can prove it. And he says, so you're going to quote me the Bible? I said, no, I'm not going to quote you the Bible. I'm going to use science and philosophy. He's like, because he's a physics major. So I did the clum. I said, do you think the universe exists? He said, yeah, of course. And I wrote down, I said, it either had a beginning or no beginning. I said, what do you think? He's like, had a beginning. He's a physics major. Had a beginning. I said, well, it was either caused or not caused. What do you think? And he's like, caused. And I said, well, there's only 2 types of causation. It's either an event causation, or it's got to be a personal agent. And I said, there are no events prior to the Big Bang. Big Bang is the first event. Sometimes when I ask people what caused the universe, they'll say the Big Bang. I'll say, no. Another story. You parked your car out in the parking lot. When you parked your car, it was totally good. Nothing wrong with it. come out after the discussion tonight and it's on fire and the fire department's putting out the car fire, and you ask the fire chief, Chief, what caused the fire? If he says to you, the fire, you're going to smack him on the side of the head and you're going to say, didn't you learn anything, idiot, in fire school? Didn't you learn anything? You're that dumb? The fire didn't cause anything. The fire is the result. And by analogy, the Big Bang is the fire. It didn't cause anything. It's the result. So I said it can't be an event. If it's either A or B, and it's not A, it's B. If the number I'm thinking about, a whole number, 1, 2, 3, 4, is either even or odd, and the number I'm not thinking about is not even, the number I'm thinking about has to be odd. It's one of two. So I said, it can't be an event. It's got to be a personal agent. And he's like, you're right. You've convinced me that God exists. Now I'm going to give him the punchline, though. The punchline is this. I looked at him, I said, James, if it's possible to have a relationship with that God, are you willing to have a relationship with him? He said, no, I'm not interested. My job is completely done. Have a great day. It was good talking to you, James. Bye. Have a nice eternity.
Okay, I just want to add on to his story. The reason that the question, where did God come from, is a false question to start with, because if you recognize that, let's assume that we know that the world come from, the universe come from the Big Bang, right? So before the Big Bang, actually, there is no space or no time, because time is actually in relative to space. If you have only one singularity, there's no time.
That's a very good
You have
point.
to have two of them, right? So if there's no time before the Big Bang, and when you begin to ask the question of, where God come from, your question actually already assumed that God is bound by space and time. So that's why that question by itself is invalid, because you're trying to kind of define God in your frame of reference of your universe of space and time. That's why that question is not even in work in the first place.
Thank you. I actually, one more thing to mention. So for our panelists, you guys know of the problem of infinite regress in philosophy? So actually, we can think about the same chain of logic when it comes to causation, right? So basically in philosophy, when you talk about infinite regress, it's that question if you can keep on asking why. Why do you believe that I'm sitting here? It's because you can see me. Why do you believe that? Why do you believe you can see me? Well, it's because my eyes work. Why do you believe your eyes work? It's because they've always worked. Why do you believe that? You don't have a good. You can keep on going, right? You can ask the same thing about the causation of the universe, right? Even if in some sense, God did not directly cause the universe, that chain of events has to end somewhere. And you can attribute that final or beginning point as, something divine in that sense. All right, well, next question. Okay, so I think often if you've spoken to an atheist, especially on the internet, this is a very popular opinion. So the idea is atheism is a neutral position. Atheism is I don't project a belief onto any extraneous gods, God, religion. It's not my thing. They say that babies come out being technically atheist, and so their idea is that they say that atheism is simply the absence of belief, and so that in reality, everyone starts out as an atheist. But they also claim that since they don't attribute their belief to any supernatural causes, they think that the universe is caused purely by material things that they can observe, right? And so they say that objective knowledge, typically, they say that the only way you can get objective knowledge is through something like the scientific method. That say science is basically their form of religion, the one that isn't dogmatic. So, what do our panelists think? Is atheism really just the absence of belief?
For Christians, we have this sense of the world, they tell us that atheism is this kind of intellectual understanding. That if you're an atheist, you're going at the world from an intellectual point of view, whereas if you are a believer or a religious person, you're coming at the world in a very emotional point of view, right? And so there's a claim for moral high ground. Like, hey, you know what? We're engaging the world as is. You guys are just being feely-feelies about the world. You guys get that? And so what I think I want to make a statement here is that atheism is not the absence of belief. Atheism is just a whole new set of beliefs that you just have to justify as much as Christianity and any other religious belief. You guys follow? And this, let me tell you how. Because for an atheist, how does an atheist belief system have to be justified? Because there are certain things that they just believe in. For example, one, how can they prove the existence of God? Okay. Ultimately, when they come to this question, right, they're saying like, well, I cannot disprove the existence of God. When we ask the question, like, you cannot disprove the existence of God, and as a believer, we look at them and say, well, how do you disprove the existence? Is there some sort of experimental data that you can actually create or do that can disprove that God did not exist? There's no external or initial cause, and the best they can give you is no. Okay, the best they can give you is it's just I believe that it just happened. The universe came to exist. I just believe it just happened. Two, right? The way that atheism is also a set of belief is that they have rational and moral obligations to themselves that they cannot explain minus belief. So, for example, for an atheist, they have morality, they have a sense of right and wrong, but they have to draw from other places to receive. Because how do you know that what you believe in is right, what you believe in is wrong? They just believe it. Okay, so as a atheist or as a believer and as a secular person, one of the things that you have to kind of come at this with is we all have a set of beliefs. You have a set of beliefs that tells you about this. As Christians, we have a set of beliefs that tells us about the universe in this way. Religious people have a set of beliefs that gives you an explanation for the universe in this way. The question is, which set of belief actually is livable, right? Which set of belief can you actually live with the human experience? Because otherwise, we're just going to be like, separate from one another and just say, hey, you believe what you believe, I believe what I believe. But what we do as Christians, or what we do in apologetics, is we compare beliefs and we compare it to the way we live. Can your belief system live out does your belief system give you a sense of meaning? Does it give you a sense of hope? Does it give you a sense of identity? Does it give you a sense of right and wrong or justice? And so for an atheist, to say that they are an absence of belief, that's a false statement. Okay? An atheist has their own set of beliefs that they have to come at it. Whatever they're going through, they have to have a set of belief that they're engaging with in order to have this answer.
I was invited to speak to the Atheist Club at USC a couple years ago. The president is a student by the name of Colin, very delightful young man. So he had actually heard me do an apologetics seminar with Cru, Campus Crusade for Christ, at USC. Greg Triplett, who is the director for Cru, invited Colin, and Colin sat in on the thing, asked me a couple questions, and he had to leave early, but he leaned over to Greg and he said, tell John he's got a standing invitation to speak to the Atheist Club anytime he wants. So Greg told me that, and I'm like, yes. So I took him up on it about 6 weeks later, and Colin and Greg and I were having dinner before the meeting that I was speaking at, and Colin says, John, I don't think things should be this way in culture. Should. And I stopped and I called him on it. I said, atheism says there is no moral absolutes. You're using a word that communicates objective moral truth, the word should. You're not entitled to use that word. He's like, you're right, but he can't say that either, but he did. And so about 30 seconds, 60 seconds later, he says another moral evaluation word, ought. John, we ought to do things this way. Ought, that's a moral word. And I called him again on it. I said, Colin, you're an atheist. Atheists don't believe in moral objectives, objective moral truth. I said, you can't use the word ought. You're not entitled to use that word. So this went on for about 15 minutes, and he kept on using moral language, which proves that his position is actually wrong. It's C.S. Lewis's argument called the moral argument. C.S. Lewis rightly argues people cannot not use moral language. It's impossible. When I'm in China, Chinese are soft, what I would consider soft atheists. You ask somebody in China, particularly a college student, do you believe in God? They say, of course not. No, of course not. And I would say, you should. And one of the ways that I get after the issue is I say to them, this relates to question or point number 2, I'll ask them, do I have a mom and a baba? Baba is the Chinese word for father. Do I have a mom and a baba? And they, well, of course you have a mom and a baba. And I push them, I say, how do you know? Have you met my mama? Have you met my baba? How do you know I have a mom and a baba? And it's such common sense that I do, they can't think of a way to verbalize it. But after they get frustrated for a little bit, they'll say, you have to have mom and a baba. I'll say, why? Wei shima? And they'll say, no mama baba? No John. That's right. No God, no universe. Universe has to have a baba in order for it to exist. And they get it. So.
I just want to do some probably more technical definition here, because truly most of the time you don't talk to atheists. Any atheists or any people who doubt about Christianity, usually they self-identify as agnostic. Agnostic means I don't know, because you cannot prove a negative. You cannot prove that there is no God. That's why people who don't believe, they claim to be an agnostic. John Ngo, Kimmy's husband, just sent me this. This is in their own word from the Scientific American website, March 20th, 2019. There was a Templeton Prize winner physicist, and he's Brazilian, but he actually, in that interview, he said that atheist is inconsistent with the scientific method. So he claimed himself to be an agnostic, but he said if you are a scientist, you cannot really be an atheist, because, scientists always, you want to seek for more knowledge. So it's okay to say, yeah, we don't know, if there's God, there's no God, or if there's God, which God it is, but you cannot really say that there's no God. So that's just some technicality. You want to basically make sure that people, when you dialogue with people, help them to understand that.
Let me take it one further, because I think a question that comes out of this is, they'll ask the question, well, what about the flying spaghetti monster, right? I don't need to know that there's a flying spaghetti monster to know that it's not real, right? And so when someone posits that question, when an atheist posits that question, what they're doing is what John said is a categorical mistake, okay? What they're using matter as a way of explaining something, right? When a religious person talks about God, we're talking about, here is matter, there's something outside of that created this matter. There's something outside of the existence of time and space that created things into existence, okay? When someone says, what about the flying spaghetti monster, what they're using matter within matter to explain themselves. You guys get that? And so when they begin to have that conversation, what they're really saying is, what you can actually engage with them in is like, ask them the question, like, well, look, think about this. Is there any way that you can create matter from nothing? Is there an experiment that you can use to create matter from nothing? If you can, right, then we'll have a bigger discussion about you only God, right? But because there is no experiment that they cannot do that, what we see is atheism, they engage in reality from a belief system. They engage in the reality of the world from a belief system. Do you guys get me? So never think that atheism has the moral high ground of intellectual ideas, and then Christianity is all about the feelies, okay? There are plenty of reasons why emotional reasons why people are atheists as well. Not just the fact that, hey, you're a Christian because, someone died in your family and you met the Lord, or you're a Christian because something happened to you and you turned to help and you found God, right? They think, oh, that's an emotional response. There are emotional responses for atheism too. Like, I didn't want to believe in God because my mom died, right? And I prayed and nothing happened, so screw God. You guys get me? And so we get into this position. So the emotional thing, take that out of the picture. The question you engage with people, especially with an atheist, is, hey, do you recognize that you're coming at me from a belief system just as much as I'm coming from you as a belief system? Do you know why it's important to do that? Because you level the playing field, right? You're not allowing for the conversation to say, you are coming at me from a higher point of view. We're saying, no, we're in the same playing field. You have a belief system, let's justify it. I have a belief system, let me justify it, okay? And so when we have that conversation, now you're having a fair conversation, okay? Whereas before, I think Christians, we have this idea like we have to fight to prove it. Where reality is like, no, let's just stay in the same level and let's just talk about our faith. Let's talk about why you believe what you believe. I'll talk about why I believe what I believe, and let's compare it. Let's compare it to reality. Which one works in reality better? And then we can have a real conversation. Does that make sense? Okay. So don't ever let an atheist tell you that I have the higher moral high ground because I'm intellectual.
I don't believe in the flying spaghetti monster either. That's what I told them, and basically you classify the same thing like the green aliens or something, right? I mean, it's the same creation. I think the main thing that I want to help people to basically wrestle with is this universe there all it is, or is there something that there is a creator beyond this universe? So you can call that whatever you are, but then I think that let's get to that foundation first.
I'm gonna punch at the third one there about supernatural and science. Science only deals with two issues. Science only deals with material substances. So, a question: does a human being possess a soul? Since a soul, by definition, is a non-material thing, science only deals with material objects. Therefore, the existence of the soul is not a scientific question. So, the supernatural often deals with non-physical realities, or what Christians claim is non-physical realities. Science has nothing to say about it because science only deals with material substances. Now, my undergraduate degree is chemical engineering. I have fond affection towards science. But science has been excessively oversold in Western culture. Science deals with a particular area called induction. There's two types of argumentation: induction and deduction. Example, induction. Ivory soap floats. No, it doesn't. Yes, it does. No, it doesn't. Yes, it does. I'll prove it to you scientifically. I go get a case of 24 bars of ivory soap at Costco. I put 7 inches, 75-degree water in the bathtub, unravel an ivory soap bar, and I throw it in the water, and it floats. I do it 24 times in a row. It floats 24 out of 24 times, and I say, I've proven to you scientifically that ivory soap floats. That's induction.
John, I think we're going to stop there for science because we have an entire section on science. So we'll get into it for sure. So, okay, so Blaise Pascal, do you guys know who Blaise Pascal was? Pascal's triangle? So he was a French mathematician, right? So one day he basically came up with this idea, right, that let's say that God, we don't know for certain that God exists, right? But there's a possibility that exists. Given that possibility, if you were to kind of calculate like an expected return on believing or not believing, then if you do believe, then you get to spend an eternity with God, right? If he exists. If you don't, then there's no problem. Or actually, if you don't, there's a big problem, sorry. If he doesn't exist, and you do believe, nothing happens to you. Or if you don't believe, nothing happens to you. So overall, if you calculate your expected return, it's more in your favor to believe that God exists. Why? Because there's an infinite kind of consequence for you not believing. But the thing is, my personal question, or actually I really wanted to pose this to our panelists because I've seen this used a lot, but the idea is, a lot of people ask this question, don't kind of consider the other side. Yes, this is something called a utilitarian argument, right? So it's saying that based on what you can expect to gain from it, it may be a good idea to believe in God. However, what if the God that exists is the one who punishes belief, So in this sense, should Christians be using Pascal's wager as an argument in and of itself?
I'm not gonna lie, I had to look up Pascal's wager. I was like, what in the world, right? I had this somewhere in my notes back in school, and then I found it hidden in like one of my folders, and I was reading up on it. But let me try to hit on it. At least from a pastor's point of view, I think Pascal's wager, okay. At the essence of what he's saying if it's better to believe in God, because if you believe in God, you're going to get something so much more, okay, versus the possibility of not believing in God, okay? So from a Christian point of view, I see this as it's missing something, because even in the Bible, James says that, the devils and the demons believe in God, and they shudder. The belief in God itself is not what's going to save us. Does it make sense? Your actual belief, the ability of your belief is not going to save you. It's the object of your belief that will save you. That's in Jesus Christ, right? And so what Pascal's wager seems to mention is just like, well, you might as well choose to believe. It brings it back onto the entity, which is you, making the choice and making the rational argument for this. But the reality is, we're supposed to look at the object of the faith that saves us, not our ability to believe in the first place. Now, the second thing is, I think Pascal's wager has been really overblown in this area. Specifically, I don't think Pascal really think of it as a bet, because it sounds like a bet. And there's like stories about him having a betting friend and like, hey, let's make a bet, and like, doing all this stuff. But Pascal's wager is pretty much like this. He looks at an atheist and he says, what is your meaning and what is your purpose for existence? What is your test for purpose and existence, right? What gives you hope? And an atheist will give you this, this, and this. And Pascal says, well, in my God and in my faith, I have that and more. So what you're telling me is, if this is what gives you your hope, your existence, and your identity of life, I'm telling you Christianity gives you all that and more. It gives you truth, revelation, a sense of direction. It gives you more than that. And so why not engage in this? Okay, you guys get me? So I think his argument came from more of a conversation, or I think it's more of the essence of it is more of, look at what you are look at what you're putting your whole life into as life, career, love. What's the meaning of your life? Family. What's the meaning of your life? Find a relationship, find a girl, find a girlfriend, find a wife. What's the meaning of your life? Travel. Okay, great. If that's the existence of your life, if that's what gives you purpose and identity, let's say you have it. In Christianity, you have all of that. And you have more. You have all that and you have more. And so I think that's where Pascal is coming at. I mean, in terms of that. So I don't think it's good to use it as a way of trying to explain or argue God. I think it's a way to maybe start a conversation with an atheist about it.
I'm not so sure if I understand your objection to the Pascal wager about what if the God that exists is the one who punished belief.
So the idea is that Pascal himself, right? If you go purely from just arguing that, there's a deity, he may exist, but the issue is we don't know the nature of this deity. So in essence, right, if we were to assign some probability, right, of this deity either being, good or malicious, either way, we wouldn't know. So there's a possibility that your belief could actually backfire. And so it may not be the best way to approach the question about, should we believe in God? Rather than saying, if you don't believe, there's going to be an eternity of punishment. We know for certain.
So I have a very short answer to the question. Is Pascal's wager an argument for God? No. One of my textbooks for my class for like a year was Handbook of Christian Apologetics by Peter Kreeft. In it, one chapter is entitled 20 Arguments for the Existence of God. And I would say to my class after they read that, I said, there's only 19 arguments for the existence of God in this chapter. Why? Prof, the chapter says there's 20. I said, there's only 19. Why? I said, it's going to be on the test. And then they get worried, That's the way to scare students. You can always get them to take notes when you say, this is going to be on the test. So I'd use that tactic. So they would, and so one of the students, bright, would say, Pascal's wager is not an argument for God. That's right. There's only 19 arguments in this chapter on the existence of God. Now, the reason why Pascal used it is within European culture during his lifetime, there was a coldness towards consideration of God. Even in what we would consider evangelical, that word was coined actually in the 50s, so it's a new word actually. Orthodoxy is the word that would be used for centuries. Orthodoxy was cold orthodoxy. They had all the right beliefs, but they could have cared less about having any experience with God. And so Pascal believed in what he called the existential shock. He was trying to get people's attention and trying to engage them in serious questions. So that's why he developed this, what is called Pascal's wager. He wanted to force people to think about this question. So it's not an argument for God, but I use it. I'm not trying to prove God by it. I'm trying to challenge the living daylights out of people. I'm trying to challenge the hell out of them, right? So I can get them to heaven.
So if I understand correctly, the Pascal wager is not really a argument for the existence of God, but you can use it to encourage people to search for God. Yes. Just like, for example, if you walk around, you see a penny that dated like 1769. Wouldn't you want to Google and see how much that penny worth? Right? So I think if Pascal basically said, well, what you want to do is if this lifetime is so short compared to whatever the return have, and then you would Google it. But then let's say if you have to go to Washington D.C. to go to the someone, if the cost too high, that may not be worth it, right? So I mean, what he said is like our lifetime is short compared to the eternal life coming up. So I think it's just an argument to spur people on to search for God.
There's a principle that we could gather from this, and one of them would be this: try to use things that are persuasive to people, not only persuasive intellectually, but persuasive emotionally and relationally. And that's why Pascal did this. So we need to, if this is helpful to get people to engage about God, thinking about God, use it. But there's other questions that might be more relevant in our culture, kind of like love, friendship, meaning, purpose, hope. Those will get our culture engaged maybe even a lot more than this Pascal's wager would.
Thank you. So that actually they dissected it well. So the question itself is loaded in the sense that you would use it to try and prove the existence of God. And again, that's why it's not something that's trying to explain. And as John said very well, is it an argument for the existence of God? No, it's not. Of course, you can use it to spark interest, this is where its own utility comes from. All right, thank you. That's the first set of questions. So right now, I'm going to leave 2 minutes for you guys to ask any other questions, please, about this topic.
I think we see some of the question that on the Mentimeter. One of them, I think, is fairly related to this topic, is that is it possible that God is just a human idea of perfection? So how would you answer that question? I think that's one of the students asked.
Is it a human reflection, human desire? Is it a reflection of human? No, it's not. There's too much evidence to indicate objectively that God exists. Is it consistent with my human desire? Yes. Yes, it is. I was interviewing a student. I asked him, you think there's life after death? He said, no. And I said, is that the way you want it to be? And he said, no, I don't want it to be that way.
Yeah, I think for me, I would answer that question. I would acknowledge their idea. Yes, it is, we will talk about people may have a wrong idea about God, but then that's separate from the objective truth about God. The question is there something, someone, a divine explanation that create the universe or not? So we talk about that. We don't talk about our idea, right? So I think that's where I'm trying to draw them back into, because it is true that, by the time that you get to the idea of there is a God, different religion may have different representation about God, and then how do we know to differentiate the God, the true God, from other imitation, right? So imitation of other religion, they have different kind of ideas, so we be able to sort that out. So in a way, it is a valid question, but it's kind of misleading at this stage.
Actually, we have a good audience question here. So the question is, does God operate in another dimension beyond the third? Wait.
I would say yes.
Yes.
And the way that I go with it is almost like a little bit on physics, right? This is my favorite example. I am a three-dimensional being. When I see from my three dimension out, you are actually like two dimension. I see John, just two dimension. I don't really see behind him, right? So if you begin to extrapolate that down, let's say if you have a being in two dimension, like flat, Mr. Flat and Mrs. Flat living in a world of like paper flat. When they look at each other, it's actually one dimension, right? So now if we talk about if you have a being in fourth dimension, in fourth dimension, you also have time. So if you're in fourth dimension, you can see in three dimension, right? So for example, what we have right now, fourth dimension, we have like 3.5. The fourth dimension would be time. So if I can freeze time, I can see around John. So I see him in three dimension. So you follow that trajectory so far, right? Now, when you begin to talk about now, if God is creating space and time, he is not bound by 2 dimension or 3 dimension or 5 dimension or whatever, right? So therefore, certain kind of miracle that in the Bible happened, like when Jesus, let's say when Jesus resurrected from the dead, and boom, he appeared in the middle of locked room. I mean, all the doors were closed, but he was there. I mean, if I just use physics alone, I say, well, you know, what if Jesus is actually in a fourth dimension or fifth dimension? Of course, he can basically freeze time, get in there, and then basically resume the time, and people say, oh, wow, he appeared, right? So if God actually create space and time, and then he would basically be not bound by space and time. So he would, in fact, be able to do all of this in multidimensional. This also explains predestination, because from our perspective, we don't know what happened in the future, right? We don't see what we know what happened in the past. But then if God is outside of our space and time, he can actually see us in the past, the present, and the future. It wouldn't be a problem for him, right? But then for us, we say, this is actually, blow my mind. I really don't understand how this could happen. But I think, if you actually take physics in that sense, I think it will help to extrapolate the idea of if you have a being outside space and time, what that being can do.
There's a book, if you're interested in this kind of heady topic, it's called God and Time. There's 4 different views in the book. It's edited by a Biola professor, a friend of mine, Greg Gansel. And it talks about God's relationship to time. And there's 4 different evangelical views. I won't tell you about them.
John, would you like to just mention the name of the book again for anyone who's interested?
God and Time.
God and Time.
So, before the universe existed, God did. So God is not time, space, matter, or energy. He's none of those 4 commodities. So he's different than the universe. But when he acts within the universe, he acts related to time and space. The resurrection happened at a particular time, particular location. So God in his nature is not time-bound, but his actions related to the universe are time-related.
So I see a lot of good questions here, and some of them even questions that I had originally planned. So right now we're just going to move on to our next topic. So this is where a lot of people have questions. So especially in our modern culture, especially ideas of about being politically correct. Is it now politically incorrect to share your religion with someone? And the questions about kind of claims to truth. Why does Christianity get to be the unique one? There's actually one question I saw about that. So we're going to answer that question in this session. And so, right, let's get into the first question. What makes Christianity special, right? So Christians have been criticized for being too exclusive. I've had a lot of experience with this in Berkeley. Actually, too many to count. If you guys want to stay behind for stories, I have a lot of them. But for now, let's keep going. So there's interesting claims. So actually, a long time ago, about I think maybe 6-7 years ago, there's this film that was going around called Zeitgeist. This is about how Christianity is a derived religion, just taking bits and pieces from other religions. I think more modern example, though, well, not so much modern, is that people often compare Christianity to some pagan religions, like saying, Christmas was originally a pagan holiday. But they say that the story of Jesus, which is very important for us as Christians, is actually a derived kind of story. They compare him to Horus. So Horus had this stint in the underworld where he tried to battle his uncle Set. Was it Set? Yeah, so basically to kind of save his father. So what they do is the analogy is that that's analogous to how Jesus kind of had to die and then come back to life. And so there's the criticism that Christianity is derived, and then the last one is that the criticism is that Christians, we have this exclusive claim to truth. That how can we say that ours is the right religion? Why don't we respect other religions? Why can't we just let other people be? Or, what if other religions just have some kind of wisdom and truth? So that's a very long list of questions. I really wanted to pack this in for you guys so we can get a kind of in-depth answer. So then right now I'm just going to hand it off to our panelists.
Yeah, that's a lot of information to go over. It seems like it's a whole lecture worth of information. But let me start with this. Every worldview is exclusive. Right? There is no such thing as an inclusive worldview. Does not matter if you go out to the outside and you say, hey, you know what? We're all love. Let's just love and be love, right? We're all exclusive because what happens the moment when you say, well, I don't want to love you? Well, then you're excluded from this group of love and be love. You guys get me? So everyone's exclusive. The real question we have to ask is, which exclusive worldview actually provides the ability for you to be inclusive? You guys get me? Let me say it one more time. Which exclusive worldview out there provides the ability for you to actually be inclusive? And what Christianity offers is it's just a beautiful resource of inclusiveness, because what we see is Christianity is exclusive. I'm not even going to lie about that, okay? We claim what? That Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. There's only one way to Christ, or one way to God, right? It's through Jesus Christ. There's a very exclusive faith. Now, in that, though, how does that bring inclusiveness? Because at the heart of Christianity, what we see is a God who became man dying for his enemies, dying for people who wanted to kill him. And in that picture, what we see is we see Jesus Christ, we see God bringing people, no matter who they are or where they are, and placing them all on the same level. Whether you are black, white, yellow, brown, whether you are homosexual, whether you're straight, whether you are transgender, it does not matter, because in the very heart of Christianity is a God dying for a broken world. You guys get me? So it levels the playing field. And so that way, when you look at someone with the Christian worldview, you can never see a person and say, I'm better than this person because I'm a Christian. Right? You can't say that, because why? Because before the gospel, Christ had to die for both you and this person. So I'm coming from a pastoral point of view here. I'm not trying to argue it from an outside point of view, but from a pastoral point of view, the way I teach my church to love people is that you have to see it through the cross. If God was going to die for you and this brother or this sister, then who are you to look at them and say that you're better than them? You guys get me? Because God died for you too. The same way, how do you look at somebody and say that you're worse than I'm not as good as so-and-so? How can you compare yourself that way when Christ died for both of you? You guys get me? So in the exclusiveness of Christianity, there's an avenue, there's an opening for inclusiveness that is beyond any other resource, any other worldview, I think, out there. So I'll start with that. We'll come back to the other stuff later because there's a lot.
1 John 2:21 says, no lie is of the truth. Truth always excludes something. It excludes falsity. 2 plus 2 equals 4. It excludes, my math professor, what's 2 plus 2? 4. How many wrong answers are there? Infinite. How many right answers? 1. So truth by its very nature is exclusive. There's only one right answer to lots of questions. What's 2 plus 2 equal? Now, if I was in a different environment, non-church environment, I was at Ohio University, I got I got messed over by a math major, so I corrected my behavior. He said, it depends upon what base number system you're talking about, John. So now when I do it in the secular audience, I say, what is 2 base 10 plus 2 base 10 equal to base 10 expressed in a whole number integer? And people are like, are you crazy? I'm like, it's the math majors. They messed me up. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
I just want to add a resource for you, all of this stuff. Josh McDowell have a series, very easy to read, series of book called The Coffee House Chronicles, where he have an account of guys who engage with his college friends, and they ask all these things about like Egyptian horrors and all this stuff. And it's very, very easy to read. It talk about like YouTube resources. I would highly recommend it. Right now they have it on sale on Amazon. So yeah, you do yourself a good service, and instead of just listen to this stuff, get some of the resource so you can read about it and know it in much, much deeper detail, right? So I think that's just something that I want to encourage you to do. The Coffee House Chronicle by Josh McDowell. So just search for it.
To hit up the third point in this, like each religion has a piece of the truth. That comes from this analogy, and I'm pretty sure you guys heard it. And it's a common analogy used by a lot of people, where basically you have a bunch of people in a room, blindfolded, and there's an elephant in the room, and everyone has a little touch on a little feel of this elephant. One man would touch the tail and say, "Oh, this animal feels like a snake." One would touch the trunk of the leg and say, "Oh, this feels like a tree." Or they'll touch like the skin. It's like, oh, it feels like a rhino. So they have a lot of different ideas, right? Everyone has a little piece of the truth, but no one has the truth. That seems like a very, very inclusive type of thinking, right? But the reality is, the only way you can make that argument is that you have to claim that you are the one that what? Sees the elephant. You have to make the claim that I'm the one that sees the elephant. I'm seeing all these blind people walking around trying to have a touch of the truth. So they're coming at it from just as an exclusive claim, because they're making an exclusive claim. I'm the one that sees the elephant. You guys don't. Okay, so you have to come and see the elephant too, right? If you want to be a inclusive person, you gotta come and see the elephant too. But reality is that's an exclusive statement. You guys get that, right? So all I gotta just remember this, okay? Especially if you guys are believers, the key is everyone is exclusive. The question is whose exclusiveness actually brings people in. And I think the Christian resource gives so much more of that. And are you guys going to answer the second one? You guys going to hit the second? Not particularly, yeah. The only thing I can say about the second point, comparing Jesus' story to that of Horus and stuff like that, is that everyone has an idea of this picture of God, right? Even when Paul went into Mars Hill, he looked at all these Stoics and philosophers. They have an idea, this understanding of who God is, or even to make sure they have an unknown God. You guys get me? So in reality, people who back then thought really deeply about God, and in thinking very deeply about God, they hit certain aspects of God that seems to mesh up with other ideas of God. So superficially, we look at this and we say, oh, this seems very familiar. Christianity seems very familiar with the Egyptian deity stories, blah, blah, blah. Yes? The only difference is this. The story of Horus, the Egyptian god, is a dead religion. And Christianity is a religion that thrives. Why? Because unlike Horus and all the other ones, Christianity is based on eyewitness testimonies, a plethora of documents and texts that gets passed on throughout the ages. There's deep belief and there's deep changes. And what happens is that there's a big difference. There is an actual one that's all up in the mind and one that stems from reality that actually creates change. Right? And so again, Christianity, unlike the other religion, though they superficially looks the same, fundamentally they're very, very different. If you look into the story of Horus, it's so much more different than Jesus' story of the resurrection and all that stuff. So that's all I have to say for that.
We can sometimes use the similarities to our advantage. So Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament about 1406, right in there. But the flood with Noah, we don't know the date of it, but it's before 2100 BC, excuse me. But that event would have been passed down verbally in all the cultures. And so we see that showing up. We see flood type of stories in all types of different regions, all different types of religious belief systems. That shouldn't be a surprise. I think it actually counts as evidence towards the validity of Christianity. So some things we can actually appropriate and use to our advantage.
That's true. If you guys are curious, just look up deluge myths. So almost every culture has one. Even the ancient Sumerians, that's one of their big myths. All right, that's good. Let's move on to the next question. So this is specifically about Christians and our kind of source text, right? How do we know the Bible is reliable, right? So the usual criticism is they say the Bible's an old, antiquated document. It was written by ancient Jews, however many thousand years ago, who had this kind of weird, worldview that modern day, it's not necessarily the, most, effective worldview. Other Christian, and then they usually split it into two parts. One is they criticize stories in the Old Testament. One, Noah's Ark, that's a very popular one to criticize, the height of Goliath. So the tallest man we've recorded to exist is about 7 feet 3 inches. I forgot his name, but Goliath was, do you guys remember? Was it 8? Yeah. So Goliath, if you guys know about statistics, if you were to go just a little bit more out on that normal distribution, the probability of that happening is just astronomically low to have someone like that. And then there's other criticisms, especially in the New Testament, directed about how the New Testament is copied. So there's some of the earliest estimates say that people waited 30 or 40 years before we got a written testimony about people or about Jesus. Or they say, Jesus was claimed to be the Son of God, which was a very common claim back in that time period. So how do we address these questions? If you're an atheist who came up and asked you, the Bible doesn't seem very reliable. Not only is the Old Testament has this angry God who seems to, espouse genocide, but then in the New Testament you have this kind of figure who's claiming to be God. Anything else?
So I'm gonna leave all the source texting to John, but I'm gonna give you all the best approach to this from a Christian point of view, right? When you begin to question and critique stuff like Noah's Ark, Goliath, and the stories of a talking donkey or a snake that in the garden, right? Or you begin to engage in these things that seems almost implausible for modern day thinkers. You guys get me? It seems like it's just too much. I can't even begin to wrap my head around that. I think that's not the correct location. I mean, especially if you begin to go down that rabbit hole, I promise you will go down that rabbit hole forever because there's always going to be another question asked after that. You guys get that? So the way you engage with a person that does not have this is the question you have to ask is this: is Jesus Christ who he says he is? Did he come back from the dead? Right? Is Jesus Christ who he says he is, and did he come back from the dead? Because if he is who he says he is, and he did come back from the dead, then you have a basis to actually engage in some of these questions. You guys get me? Otherwise, you're just going to go down a rabbit hole. Let me give you an example. Paul, the Apostle Paul, according to the Shema, which is the Old Testament idea, is like the Lord your God is one, right? Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. Paul in his mind believed that God is only one in essence, one being, one person, one, right? And yet, on the road to Damascus, Paul got a whole entire life change. You know why? Because here he saw Jesus Christ. He calls him Lord. I am the one that you are persecuting. And so Paul in his mind is thinking, my whole life, I thought that God is only one, and yet now I see God as a man and as a person. How do I wrap myself around that? Okay? And so when he began to wrap his mind around the fact that Jesus Christ is who he says he is, then his beginning to understanding of who God is and all that stuff in the scriptures begin to change. And he's able to connect all of these storylines, all these narratives together. You guys follow me? So the better question you have to ask And the better question you have to get really good at answering is Jesus Christ who he says he is, and is the resurrection real? If you can get them to at least give enough arguments for the idea of it, for the heart of it, then you can say, well, then it's not outside the realm of belief that Noah can have these animals. It's not outside the realm of the belief that Goliath is this way or the narrative is like this. You guys get that? And so you stop going down these rabbit holes of questioning. And that's the worst thing to do. Is because I remember sitting down with people and doing my best to answer every single one of their questions, but there's like a million questions. They'll nitpick every single thing, and after a while I'm like, dude, look, Jesus Christ resurrected, he's alive, okay? If that's true, everything else falls into place. We have to wrestle with those things, honestly. If that's not true, then whatever, throw it away, Then forget the whole entire Old Testament, New Testament. But if he is, then we have an actual real wrestling with this. This is what the narrative says. This is what he quotes. What do we say to that?
I think I totally agree with Tony about keep Jesus central. And the way that I explain to people is when you view history is like this. Thinking about it is like an orb like this. At the center of the orb, of this history line, is Jesus Christ, his birth and his death and his resurrection. That's the center of the history. When you go toward, one end, the beginning of the universe, and the other end, the end of the universe, that get a little bit more blurry. Even Christian, we may not even agree of how old is the earth would be, or whether or not this end are we going to have like a 1,000 year of peace, whether or not it's literal or not symbolical, So we have that. So at the center, the main important thing is Jesus and his resurrection, whether or not he's the Son of God, right? If you actually believe in Jesus as the Son of God, and then you would begin to move from what you know to what you don't know. For example, if Jesus referred to Adam and Eve, if Jesus referred to Noah, if Jesus believed that, and then I think I'm pretty good to basically in good company to believe what Jesus believed, right? So I think that's where you go from there. Now, one of the really, really good, interesting argument about Jesus and being the Son of God was uncommon claims or not. You have to basically take a look into the history and the context of the time. So what happened, you have on the east, India, China, what you have is you have this idea of, God is in everybody, right? God is in you, God is in the tree, God is in everywhere, right? So God is very common. If someone who say, yeah, I'm the Son of God, God's in everyone, so that's fine. On the west, you have the Greco-Romans who also believe that, Zeus and Hercules and all these gods actually, they have a bunch of gods, they mingle with man. So if somebody say, hey, I'm the Son of God, Augustus claimed the same thing, and that's probably okay with them too. But in between the East and the West, you have a very special culture. The Jewish people for thousands of years, they actually were the only monotheistic kind of society in this pluralistic culture. And in that culture, God is one. So if you actually claim to be the Son of God, you claim to be equal to God, that's blasphemy. That's why they nailed Jesus, right? That's why they killed Jesus. So for the Jewish people, for his disciple, to recognize that he is the Son of God, that he is God himself, this is like a major, major shift in their society, in their thinking. So that's why it may be, they may argue, it's maybe a common claim because Augustus, other Caesar claimed the same thing, or people in India claim the same thing. It may be right in that, far west and east, but not in the Jewish culture. So that's why his claim is even more important, right?
Two critical questions related to the scriptures. First, maybe not, two questions. Is what I have in my hand today what was originally written? Second question, is what was originally written actually true? If the answer to question 2 is what was originally written true, if the answer is no, it's not true, it's irrelevant whether or not I got the original text today or not. It's irrelevant. It's pointless. But if what was originally written is true, the first question becomes critical, and that is what I have in my hand today substantially close to the original that was written? And then that question deals with three issues. This is from, C.S. Lewis, Josh McDowell. Bibliographical test, internal evidence test, external evidence test. Three tests to prove biblical validity. Bibliographical test deals with when was it written and when do we have the first copies of it? And how many copies do we have of the text? That's the bibliographical. Internal evidence, is it consistent with itself? External evidence, is it consistent with history, archaeology, science when it makes a scientific statement? So those are the three tests. I was at one of the Kansas schools, and I was doing a lecture entitled The Occult, the Supernatural, and Life After Death. And there was a coven of witches. It was a student group on the campus. They were at my lecture because they saw the word occult. And they wanted to represent themselves. So during the Q&A time, a gal, she wasn't a student. She's quite a bit older than me. And she said, my name is Debbie, and I don't have a question, but I have a statement. I thought, oh, baby, hold on to your seats. We're going for a ride on this one. It's always a danger when people say that. I don't have a question, but I'm like, oh, Lord, help. So she starts criticizing the New Testament. She's like, there's hardly any manuscript evidence. There's no documentation. She just went on, and the audience was getting kind of irritated with her. And so I said, Deb, you have 30 seconds to finish up. So she did. And I kind of put a little gasoline on the fire for her. And I said, so not many manuscripts. How many manuscripts are there for the New Testament, Deb? 5? 50? How many? You said there's very few. How many? She's like, I don't know how many, but there's not very many. I was like, oh, man. She is so dead in the water right now, she doesn't have a clue. But she's going to find out really, really quick. So then I politely gave her some examples of the writings of Aristotle and Plato and Caesar's Gallic Wars and the manuscript evidence, the time period between it. So like Aristotle, the time period when he wrote it, about 400 BC, the first copy that we have is 100 AD. So the time period between when he wrote, when we have a copy, is 1,400 years. A little bit of time, right? 1,400 years? How many manuscripts do we have of Aristotle's writings? Now, a little tangent. If you take a philosophy class at any university on the face of the Western civilization, particularly America, and you question Aristotle's writings, the professor is going to point you to the door and tell you to get the heck out of his classroom because they're revered. How many manuscripts are there of Aristotle's writings? 49. What's the time interval between the New Testament, the first partial copy? 25 years. John Ryland Papyri dated 125. We have a complete copy of the New Testament by 200. Even before that, probably about 130. How many manuscripts, hand printed, not printing press, Gutenberg? How many manuscripts do we have of the New Testament? 25,000. And so I shared this data with the audience. And afterwards, one of the witches said to one of the crusade students, after what John said tonight, I am never going to question the reliability of the New Testament ever again. Thank you.
Actually, there's a short version of that on Netflix called, what is it, Josh McDowell's story. What was it, the name? The Case for Christ. He was an atheist, and he basically questioned everything, and he gone through, and they make it to a very good, entertaining movie. But it's
Lee Strobel.
good.
Lee Strobel.
Yeah, there you go. Lee Strobel.
Yeah.
So that's also really, really good stuff too. If you guys don't want to read, watch the movie.
Yeah, one of my favorite books on this is written by a lot of professors that I had was Jesus Under Fire, Modern Scholarship Reinvents the Historical Jesus. It's a great book in talking about evidence for the resurrection, talking about how we can deal with manuscripts. Like, is the manuscripts, how are they passed on? They give a great textual background. They give you a lot of evidence behind it, and it's a tough read. It takes a while to read through, but once you get through it, man, it's gold. Okay, there's lots of nuggets in there. Jesus Under Fire.
Easier book to read, much more fun. More Than a Carpenter by Josh McDowell.
So I heard my team back there, could you guys like make a list just quickly too? So just at the end, if anyone needs to. So we're actually coming up on our dinner time, but let's just try to get this next question in, and if we go over, a little, maybe 2 or 3 minutes, I'll cut it off, and we'll have some food, and we'll recongregate, right? So next question. So this is more one of the more fundamental questions, right? Why is there hell, right? And the idea is that a lot of people coming to Christianity, they think about God being love, and then they question the idea of hell. Why does there have to be a hell where people are eternally separated from God? Or what crime deserves an eternal punishment? And so the basic claim is they think that hell contradicts God's nature. But as Christians, I think we have a more nuanced view, so I'm going to leave that to our panelists to describe.
They push it to me to go first, so I will make it short. I think according to the Bible, what Jesus said that actually hell was created for the devil and his demons. So originally, I don't think hell was intended for human being. So what happened is, I think when after the devil rebelled and destined to hell, he began to see human beings. So the best thing that revenge would be drag human being to rebel against God and end up into the same place with him. So I think in a way, I think that's where I would help people to understand that line that Jesus said, to help them to see that. And the other thing that I would like to state is most of the time we think that God kind of, push people to hell, and then when they fall down, they're trying to cry out, and he was just laughing at them, he sent people to hell. In a way, what the picture that the Bible actually describes is when Adam and Eve sin and choose to basically to lead the whole human race rebel against God, we actually already destined to hell anyway. So all of us is destined for that. That's why, and when Jesus actually came and rescued us out of that, is completely different. I remember there was one Bible study that I have, and this guy has come to our Bible study. And the first thing in the Bible study, he was confronted. So you are a Christian. Do you think that I'm Buddhist? I'm going to hell, right? Is that what you believe, right? And they're very confrontational. And I said, no. I think you must understand what Christian belief is. Everyone going to hell, you and me included, right? So I think the whole thing is basically all of us rebel against God, all of us destined for that. And what Christian believe is God actually, in His mercy, He sent His Son to basically to rescue us from hell. So I think that is the kind of a more correct picture rather than, you choose God and God will get you to heaven, you don't, and He'll just like slam you to hell. No, I think we destined all to go to hell to start with.
Why do we have prisons in California? Because people do bad things, right? Right? You got rapists, child molesters, murderers, serial killers. You have to put those people, you have to lock them up, otherwise they're going to continue to do bad things. So we build prisons. In fact, we don't even have enough prisons in California. We actually have to ship prisoners out of state in California because we have so many people that have done violent crimes. But you build prisons because people do bad things. So in a sense, by analogy, God had to build a prison called hell because people do bad things. We don't build prisons just because we like prisons. It'd be a waste of money and time. We only build them because we have bad people that have to be incarcerated.
I actually really like this question because this is the question that I posited before I became a believer. I asked this question because my father passed away. I was a Buddhist, and my father passed away. And I remember I was talking to one of my friends who was trying to witness to me, and I said, my dad was he's a pretty decent guy. So according to Christianity, he's in hell. And I saw her face, and she looked at me like, young high school girl, and she just, like, how do I answer this question? Like, do I tell him his dad's in hell? Like, that's such a mean thing to say, And I think she gave an answer. It wasn't like a very clear answer, but God was working my heart anyway, so that was a whole different thing. But the reality is, this is a very fundamental question to ask, right? Because, like, how can you just tell someone, hey, you're going to hell? Sorry, man. Like, I don't know what to tell you, right? But let me posit this with an illustration, right? I use my grandma. My grandma's the best illustration for all these things. So when I first knew my grandma, well, actually, I always knew my grandma as this grumpy old lady, grumpy, nagging lady. And so I asked my grandpa, like, why did you marry her? Like, she is such a nag, right? And my grandpa said, no, she used to not be like this. She used to be sweet. And man, she used to complain a little bit, but, like, this is a whole new level. And I'm like, what happened? I said, time, right? So here is the reality of the human spirit. Is here we are, and as time takes us down this line, whatever it is that drives our heart, the Bible calls it sin. What it does is it just makes us worse. We become worse versions of it. I mean, if we're selfish, ultimately you spiral into deeper selfishness, right? If you are a person that is grumpy, eventually, first you just kind of grumpy a little bit, then over time you become really grumpy, then really grumpy. And as time goes, you're just constantly spiraling. Now, what if death doesn't stop that? What if you're constantly spiraling forever? What is the trajectory that you're on if that is the way we're going? You guys get me? And don't just take one aspect, take every aspect of the human heart, right? Whether you're a person that's always jealous. What if jealousy becomes really bad and death doesn't end there, but death is just, eternity. You just keep spiraling out there. See, hell, according to Scripture, I think, is that continuous spiral. I don't think the Scripture talks about hell in terms of when people go to hell, they just kind of die. They're like, oh my goodness, I messed up. I want to get out. Actually, the Bible gives a story that when people are moving towards hell, they actually get even more upset of why they're not in heaven. Right? And the story that I have that makes the best illustration for this is Jesus' story about the rich man and Lazarus. I'll try to do my best to go through this real fast. The story of the rich man and Lazarus parable is the rich man lived in his house, he had his food and all this stuff. The Lazarus was this poor guy on the streets, right? And when they both died, Lazarus came into what we call Abraham's bosom, heaven. The rich man went into Hades, hell, okay? Now, the story goes like this. While the rich man was in Hades, you know what he did when he looked up and he saw Abraham and he saw Lazarus? He said, Abraham, can you send Lazarus down here to dip some water to give it to me? Right? The rich man is already in death. He doesn't feel like, hey, he didn't say, I want to get out of here. Can you find a way for me to get out? He told Abraham, hey, bring Lazarus down here because he still feels what? He still feels like he's the rich man. He still feels like he's entitled. So he's telling this guy, bring the poor beggar that you see on my street, come down to service me still. You guys get that? And then Abraham said, we can't get there. I'm sorry. Then he says, well, then send Lazarus to tell my brothers and sisters about what happened to me. So again, the rich man is not saying to himself, hey, I need to change or I need to get out of this. He is still in his state complaining and nagging like, hey, I'm here. I'm not trying to get out, but go do something else about this. Hell is like that, right? Hell is when you die, you're in this trajectory. The fact that your life did not want God, after you die, guess what? You're still not going to want him, right? And if that life is in this eternal trajectory, what you're going to become is just worse and become a shell of a person. That nagging spirit that you had becomes a grumbling spirit, and what C.S. Lewis calls, you just ultimately become just the grumble. You lose your humanity, you're just the grumble. That angry spirit that you had becomes a place where it becomes beyond angry, and then you're no longer anything but the anger, right? And so hell is this destruction of humanity. As you go to hell, you're not spiraling down and say, oh, Jesus Christ, help me. You're spiraling down, you say, well, I should get mine. I did all these things, how come I didn't get that? So it's this picture of hell, I think it's the way that Jesus describes it is when you die and you're in that trajectory, you're not going to get out. You're actually going to continue wanting to go down that way.
All right. Thanks.